There is a particular quality to the silence that comes after a fleet dies. It is not the absence of sound. Ships in space do not make sound. There is no medium to carry it, and the deaths of 200 warships spread across 400,000 kilometers produces no noise that the human ear can register. What it produces is the absence of signal. 200 transponders that were broadcasting, and then were not. 200 voices on the command net, and then nothing. Not data, not interference, nothing. The instruments simply show the frequency in use, and then the frequency empty, and the mind fills the gap with a silence it invents. Because the alternative is to understand that 200 ships stopped being ships and became debris. In the span of time it takes a person to take a breath and let it out and take another, and that understanding is the kind that, once admitted, does not leave. Sarah Voss had admitted it at Proxima. She had admitted all of it. The last thing Commander Sarah Voss remembered before the Kethal bombardment was the smell of rain on hot metal. It was the smell of the Orizaba's hull in a monsoon, back when the ship was still docked at Callisto Station, back when the war was a rumor and her mother was still alive, and the galaxy had not yet discovered what it had made the mistake of waking. She would think of that smell later, during the long drift through the debris field, during the days of silence when the nav grid was dead and the emergency lighting turned everyone's face the color of a bruise, and she would decide that it was the smell of before, everything before the Kethal, everything before the first fleet died at Proxima and humanity learned, in the span of 4 hours and 11 minutes, that it was not alone, that it was small, and that something in the dark had decided small things needed to be removed. The Orizaba was not small. That was the point of her. She was 4 kilometers from bow to stern. She carried 16 mass driver batteries, each capable of accelerating a tungsten slug to a measurable fraction of light speed. She had ablative armor 14 meters thick at the prow, layered in alternating ceramic and compressed titanium alloy, with a shock dispersion lattice underneath that engineers at the Titan yards had spent 11 years developing, and that the Kethal had cracked in approximately 40 seconds during the Battle of Ceres. She had a crew of 2,312. She had a name that came from a mountain. Mountains, the design committee had reasoned, do not move. Mountains endure. Mountains are, in the geological sense, permanent. The Kethal had killed 2/3 of her crew before she limped across the heliopause. Commander Sarah Voss had not been part of the design committee. She had not chosen the name. She had inherited the Orizaba the way you inherit a house after a flood. What's left is yours, but what's left is not what it was. She stood on what remained of the bridge and watched the tactical display cycle through empty space, and tried to remember if she had eaten in the past 30 hours. She didn't think she had. She decided she didn't care. "You're doing the thing again," said Chief Engineer Tomas Beltran from behind her. He had a voice like gravel shifting in a tin can, permanently roughened by 2 decades in engine rooms, and he had a habit of appearing at her shoulder when she was thinking about things she didn't want to think about. She had decided a long time ago that this was one of his more useful qualities. What thing? The staring thing. The calculating our odds and finding them unacceptable thing. Our odds are unacceptable, probably. He handed her a meal pack. She didn't look at it. "We're being followed, you know. I know. 3 ships, maybe 4. The long-range array is still mostly dead, so I'm estimating by gravimetric shadow. Where are they? About 6 light minutes behind. They've been matching our acceleration curve for the past 18 hours. She looked at him then. He had a burn scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone, new enough that the skin was still shiny and tight. He'd gotten it sealing a hull breach during the Kethal's second wave. He'd used his body to hold a section of emergency membrane in place while his team welded around him. She didn't know if he even remembered doing it, or if the shock had taken the memory. She decided not to ask. "They're not firing," she said. "No, why aren't they firing?" Beltran considered this. He had a face built for consideration, broad, patient, weathered, and he used it like a tool. "Options," he said. 1, they're waiting for us to stop running so they can enjoy the kill. 2, they want the ship intact. 3, they've got something else planned. Option 4. He raised an eyebrow. "They want us to lead them somewhere," she said. The silence stretched between them like a wire. "You think they know about the horizon point," he said. "I think they've been listening to every frequency we have for the past 3 months. I think if they don't know about the horizon point, they at least know we're running towards something." The horizon point. She turned the words over in her mind the way you turn a stone over and look at what lives underneath. The horizon point was the reason the Orizaba was still moving. It was the reason she hadn't done what every tactical protocol demanded she do, which was to turn the ship around and throw everything they had left at the pursuing fleet and die fighting, which was considered the honorable end for a warship with 1/3 of its original complement and a nav grid running on emergency backup. The Horizon Point was the thing her mother had told her about, in a briefing that was not a briefing, in a room that was officially not a room, on a station that officially did not exist. Her mother, who had been an admiral. Her mother, who had died at Proxima with the First Fleet. Her mother, who had planned ahead. "Keep the heading," Sarah said, "and get me Specialist Dara Einen. I need the long-range array functional in the next 6 hours. The array's basically scrap, then tell Inan to unscrap it." She turned back to the tactical display. The 3, maybe 4, Kethal shadows crept along behind them in their slow, patient pursuit, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about weights at the end of a horizon, and she ate the meal pack without tasting it and watched the stars. Specialist Dara Einen was 26 years old and had never intended to be on a warship. She had intended to be a radio astronomer. She had intended to spend her career in quiet rooms, pointing enormous antennas at distant galaxies and listening for the mathematical signatures of intelligent life which had seemed, at the time of her enrollment in the Ganymede Institute's astrophysics program, like a reasonable career. The Kethal had ruined that ambition the same way they had ruined most things, without announcement, without ceremony, without the courtesy of giving humanity time to prepare. What the Kethal had taught her, inadvertently, was that she was very good at listening. She crouched in the cavity between decks 4 and 5, where the long-range array's junction box lived, which was to say where the long-range array's ruined junction box lived, surrounded by components that had been fused together by the energy discharge from a Kethal proximity weapon. The smell in the cavity was metallite, and scorched insulation, and something sweet and chemical that she didn't want to identify. She had been working for 4 hours. She had made, by her count, no meaningful progress. "Tell me something useful," said Petty Officer Gaunt from the hatch above her. He was her assistant, a tall, melancholy young man from the Martian settlements who had a gift for handing her exactly the wrong tool at exactly the right moment. "I can tell you that whoever designed this array built the fail-safes exactly wrong," she said. "Whoever designed this array built the fail-safes to protect the components from a power surge, which means when the housing took an energy discharge, the fail-safes locked everything down and now I can't access anything below the tertiary bus. Can you bypass the fail-safes? Probably not." She looked at a component that had been, until 6 weeks ago, a crystal oscillator worth about 400,000 credits. It was now a lump of glass and metal that looked like something a child had made from the contents of an ashtray. "I can route around the tertiary bus." "Through what?" "The passive sensor array. It wasn't designed for this. It'll burn out in maybe 3 or 4 hours once I get it running, and we'll lose all passive sensor capability, but it'll give the commander what she needs." There was a pause while Gaunt considered this. "She needs the array for 6 hours, he said. "I know." Another pause, "And she needs it to start working within 6 hours. "I know. So if it burns out in 3 or 4, I know." She could hear him thinking. It had a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible exhalation through the nose, a rhythm she had learned to recognize over the past 3 months as the sound of a person who wanted to point out the obvious, but had learned not to. "I'll have it running in 4 hours, she said. "Tell the commander she gets 4 hours, maybe 5. She said 6. "Tell her I said 4. Silence. Then, "She's going to be angry. She's going to be grateful. She just doesn't know it yet." Einen pulled a circuit segment free from the fused housing with a sound like tearing fabric. "Hand me the adaptive relay." The small one. The correct tool appeared at her hand. She allowed herself a moment of genuine surprise. "You have those more often than you think," she told him. "Have what?" "Good moments," she heard him almost smile. The Kethal did not have a word for patience. Linguists who had studied the intercepted communications, which existed in a range of frequencies that overlapped the high end of human hearing, and seemed to involve harmonics that human vocal cords could not reproduce, believed that the concept simply did not translate. Not because the Kethal were impatient, but because from their perspective, the concept of waiting implied an awareness of time as a dimension that moved in one direction, and the Kethal, as near as anyone could tell, did not experience time that way. They experienced it the way humans experience a room, as a space they moved through, with dimensions and obstacles, rather than a current that carried them. This was, from a tactical standpoint, terrifying. A species that does not experience time as a one-way flow does not tire, does not grow bored, does not make the small, impatient errors that come from the mounting pressure of waiting for something to happen. The Kethal ships behind the Orizaba had been maintaining their exact relative position for 18 hours, and they would maintain it for 18, more if that was what the geometry required, moving through the dimension of time the way a person moves around a piece of furniture, carefully, deliberately, without the rising urgency of someone who needs to be somewhere. Tactical Officer Yuen Fasai had been the one to figure this out. She'd been the one to piece it together from the fragments of behavioral data they'd collected over 3 months of running. The precise, unhurried way the Kethal ships adjusted their courses. The absence of any acceleration surge when it seemed like they should have pressed their advantage. The systematic, methodical quality of their weapons fire, which was not the fire of something enraged, but of something doing a calculation. She had presented her findings to Commander Voss in a 16-minute briefing and watched the commander's face do something that was not quite becoming afraid, but was adjacent to it, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw, and then the commander had said thank you in a voice that meant everything she'd just heard was now a weight she would carry alone. Fasai sat at her station now and watched the gravimetric shadows. She had a habit, when she was thinking hard, of touching the small pendant she wore under her uniform. A chip of polished basalt from the north, African coast, given to her by her grandmother when she was 7. Her grandmother had told her it was from the oldest part of Africa, from the rock that had been there before the dinosaurs, before the first fish crawled out of the sea, before nearly everything. She had told her, when you hold this, you hold something that has survived everything. She had not, in fairness, anticipated the Kethal. But the stone was still there. Fasai touched it now. They've adjusted, she said. Navigator Priya Mendel looked up from her panel. Adjusted how? They've spread their formation. Previously, they were stacked in a trailing column. Now they're fanning laterally. 3 degrees of separation between each ship. Fasai watched the shadows on the display. They're preparing to bracket us. How much time? At current relative velocity, they could complete the envelopment in about 14 hours, more if they're methodical. Mendel was quiet for a moment. She was the youngest person on the bridge, 23, with a face that still showed surprise when things went badly, which Fasai had decided was either a sign of youth or extraordinary psychological resilience. So they're not waiting for us to stop, Mendel said. They're positioning for a kill box. Yes. Which means we have about 14 hours before they can fire from all sides simultaneously. And there's nothing left. Yes, and the commander knows. Fasai touched the basalt pendant. The commander knows. Sarah Voss had a photograph in her quarters. She kept it in the top drawer of the small metal cabinet beside her bunk, which meant she had to make a deliberate choice to look at it, which meant she didn't look at it often, because she didn't like what deliberate choices said about the people who made them. She had made a deliberate choice to look at it tonight. The photograph showed her mother in dress uniform, standing on the observation deck of what had been Titan Station before the Kethal took it. Her mother was not smiling, which was how she looked in all photographs, not because she was unhappy, but because she had decided a long time ago that smiling for photographs was a kind of performance and she didn't perform. She had a straight back and a steady gaze and gray hair cut close to her skull, and she looked like what she was, a woman who had decided early that the universe owed her nothing, and she was fine with that. She had passed those things to Sarah. The straight back, the gaze, the understanding that the universe was indifferent. She had also passed her the files about the Horizon Point in a data chip that had arrived in a sealed container 6 days after Titan Station fell, addressed in her mother's handwriting, stamped with a personal cipher that Sarah had thought, with the particular grief of an adult child, was something her mother had invented for birthday messages. It had not been invented for birthday messages. The Horizon Point was, in the driest possible terms, a fold in normal space created by a gravitational resonance phenomenon that occurred near the L4 Lagrange point of a binary system approximately 47 light-years from Sol. The physics involved were not fully understood. What was understood, if you positioned a sufficiently massive object, a warship for instance, at the focal point of the resonance, the fold could be manipulated, not traveled through, not weaponized. Something more specific, something the Kethal, who experienced time as a room rather than a current, would never have conceived. Her mother had understood what humanity would need. Not more ships, not bigger weapons. Something the Kethal had never built a defense against, because they had never needed to defend against it. Something that could only be done once. Sarah put the photograph back in the drawer. She had 14 hours, maybe 12, and a crew of 791, and a ship that was still, in its structural bones, the mountain they had named it for. She walked to the bridge, and she told them what they were going to do, and she watched their faces as they understood it. and she thought that this was what she had inherited from her mother. Not the steadiness, not the indifference to the universe's debts, but the specific skill of telling people something terrible and somehow making them believe it was possible. The next hours had a quality of contained fury. That was the only way Sarah could describe it later. 791 people moving through a ship that had been designed for twice their number, working on tasks that were 3 times more demanding than what those twice as many people would normally have been asked to do, and doing it without complaint, without freezing, without the particular kind of quiet collapse that she had seen in other ships' crews. The moment when the arithmetic of survival becomes undeniable and the human mind simply refuses the sum. They did not refuse. They bent into it. Ein got the long-range array running in 3 hours and 40 minutes, not 4, and she did not mention this to anyone as if it proved anything about her estimate. The array showed them what Fasai had already inferred. 4 Cathal warships in a fan formation, spreading their bracket, patient as the deep rock. Beltran's team, working in 3 shifts in the main engine bay, rerouted power from every non-essential system aboard the ship. Life support trimmed to the minimum. Sustainable threshold gravity plating in the uninhabited decks cut entirely. Communications reduced to short range only. The Orizaba's thrust output increased by 31%. It was not enough to outrun the Kethfall. It was enough to change the timeline, from 14 hours to 18. Mendel, running navigational calculations on 2 screens simultaneously, had mapped the approach to the horizon point with a precision that Fasai, who watched over her shoulder for much of this, found quietly astounding. The approach required threading the Orizaba through the gravitational gradient of the binary system at an angle that would keep them outside the accretion disk's outermost shell while still placing them at the resonance focal point, and it required doing this with an accuracy of approximately 200 meters over a distance of 1.3 SU-Utes. On a ship with a compromised nav grid running on emergency backup, with a pursuing fleet that would likely begin firing before they reached the focal point. Mendel did not say this was impossible. She said it would be a precision problem, which Sarah had come to understand was her term for anything she was going to do anyway, regardless of the odds. "Walk me through the firing window," Sarah said, standing beside her. Mendel pulled up the overlay. The Kethal will complete their bracket envelopment in approximately 17 hours. And 40 minutes at their current spread rate. They'll want to fire from established positions. They're methodical, they don't overcommit. That gives us approximately. She traced a line on the display. A 4-hour window after we reach the focal point before they're in optimal firing position. Is 4 hours enough? For the resonance buildup, the theoretical models say 90 minutes. The theoretical models. Mendel's expression was carefully neutral. Your mother's files say the models are conservative by a factor of 2. My mother's files were written 12 years ago. The physics hasn't changed. Sarah looked at the line on the display. The horizon point was marked as a small gold circle, which seemed insufficient. And after, she said. What happens to the Orizaba after? Mendel was quiet for a moment. The resonance propagation would set the gravitational field in a radius of approximately. What happens to the Orizaba? Another pause. The ship survives, probably. The hull stress calculations show she can withstand, probably. The uncertainty comes from the variables in the resonance strength, which we can't measure precisely until we're at the focal point. The range is between hull stress within tolerance and significant structural damage. It's unlikely to be fatal to the crew. Define unlikely. Mendel looked at her. She had a young face but old eyes, the kind that had seen enough in 3 months to stack years onto a person's internal count. 73%, she said, based on the best models I can build. Sarah held that number. 73%, roughly 3 and 4. Not bad odds if you were betting on a horse. Uncomfortable odds if you were talking about 791 people. She thought of her mother. She thought of the expression on her mother's face in the photograph. Not smiling, straight-backed, gaze level. And she thought about what it had taken to write those files, to plan that far ahead, to know you were going to die at Proxima and do it anyway, and leave instructions for the daughter who came after you. She thought about what kind of love looks like a data chip in a sealed container stamped with a birthday cipher. Set the course, she said. 8 hours from the horizon point, the Kethal fired. Not the coordinated terminal barrage from a completed bracket. They weren't in position for that yet, but a ranging shot, a probe, the kind of fire designed to measure your response and your capability, and the quality of your shield systems. The Orizaba caught 2 Kethal energy lances on her port side ablative armor, and the bridge shook, and the emergency lighting flickered, and Somewhere below them, a secondary power conduit screamed and vented plasma, and Beltran's voice came over the comm saying words that Sarah was fairly certain were not in any official lexicon, and then the ship steadied and they kept moving. Fasai read the damage report in 17 seconds. Port side armor, decks 9 through 14. Ablative layer 2 is gone. Layer 3 is holding. No hull breach. Return fire? At this range, our mass drivers have about a 12% hit probability against their evasion profile. Fire anyway. Commander, we're not running, Sarah said, and her voice was level in a way that she had learned from her mother, that tone that closed the space for argument without raising itself. We're not a fleeing ship. We're a ship on a heading. There's a difference and they need to see it. Fasai fired. 2 mass driver batteries. The tungsten slugs traveled the distance in the long silence of physics, and against the 12% odds, one of them clipped the leading Cathal ship's forward section. The gravimetric shadow briefly bloomed, with what Fasai identified as debris from a non-essential external structure. Minor hit, she said. Good, Sarah said. The Cathal did not increase their pursuit speed. They adjusted their formation marginally and continued their methodical encirclement. Sarah watched them do it, and felt something that was not satisfaction and not comfort, but was in the same neighborhood as recognition. She thought, I know what you are. You are the thing that doesn't panic. You are the thing that doesn't make errors under pressure. You have won because you are the thing that just continues, patient and vast and inexorable, and we have been losing because we do not know how to fight something that does not experience the pressure of time. She thought, but we built the pressure for you anyway. We built it into the physics. We put it there 12 years ago. She thought, I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry you didn't get to see this. What Sarah did not say aloud, what she carried alone in the hours after the first Cathal probe, was the weight of what she had read in her mother's files about the nature of the enemy. The Cathal had not arrived at Earth's doorstep because they wanted territory. They had not arrived because they were expanding. They had arrived because they were cleaning. That was the word her mother had used in the files, based on everything the intelligence division had pieced together from the interceptive communications and the behavioral patterns, and the one linguist, a woman named Osei, who was dead now, who had managed to construct a partial working model of Cathal semantic structure. Cleaning, the removal of things that were, by their metrics, unnecessary. A species that experienced time as a room moved through that room with a purpose that was not aggressive in the way human warfare was aggressive. It was administrative. Humanity, by some calculation that no human being had been able to fully reconstruct, had been classified as clutter. This was in some ways more frightening than conquest. Conquest at least implied that something about you was worth conquering. Clutter just needed to be cleared. 6 hours out, Einan found her in the engine bay. This was unusual. The engine bay was not a place Sarah typically came. It was Beltran's territory, and the protocols of shipboard. Life invested certain spaces with a kind of ownership that everyone understood without stating. But Sarah had found that in the hours before something irrevocable, she needed to move through the ship, needed to hear and feel the machinery, the hum of the drives, the particular vibration of ship under sustained thrust that traveled up through the deck plates and into the bones of your feet. It grounded her. It told her the Orizaba was still alive. Inan came to stand beside her. She was small, with ink-dark eyes and calloused hands, and a streak of gray in her hair that she'd had since her second year at the Ganymede Institute, and that she had explained once as a genetic quirk, and never mentioned again. She smelled of scorched insulation and sealant foam, which she always did when she'd been working, which was always. Hooray, Sarah said. How much longer? An hour, maybe. The passive sensor reroute is holding better than I expected. She paused. Commander, I've been running calculations on the resonance. Sarah looked at her. Not the hull stress calculations, Mendel has those. I've been modeling the electromagnetic component of the propagation. What happens to the Cathal ships when the resonance hits them? She pulled up a small display on her wrist unit. The resonance doesn't discriminate by ship type. It compresses the gravitational field across a radius of approximately 8 SGUs. I know. The Cathal ships will be within 6 AU when we reach the focal point. I know. They're not going to survive the field compression. I know. A silence. The engine bay hummed around them, the great drives cycling in their rhythmic alternation, the sound of something enormous staying alive. I wanted you to know I knew, Inan said quietly, that I ran the numbers myself and I understand what we're doing. I'm not going to ask questions about it or raise ethical considerations because I understand that there aren't any other options and that the Cathal are going to kill every human being in reach if they can. So, she paused. I just wanted you to know that I know, and I'm all right. Sarah looked at her. The engine bay light was orange and warm, the oldest colors, fire colors, the colors that had lit human faces since the first fire was made in the first dark. Einan's face was steady in it. 26 years old, never wanted to be on a warship, listening to the universe for signs of intelligent life and finding it, and it was this. Thank you, Sarah said. Don't thank me yet, Einan said. Thank me when we're through. 5 hours out, Gaunt found Einan back in the cavity between decks 4 and 5, not working but sitting cross-legged in the cramped space with her back against the bulkhead and her eyes closed. This was unusual enough that he stood at the hatch for a moment, uncertain whether she was sleeping or doing something meditative, or had simply stopped for a moment in the least comfortable place available on the ship. Specialist, he said. I know, she said without opening her eyes. Array's still running. I know. Mendel wants confirmation of the focal point coordinates through the array within the next 2 hours. I know. He was quiet. Then are you all right? She opened her eyes. They were in the cavity together. Well, she was in the cavity, and he was half in and half out of the hatch, which was the maximum they could both fit. It was close and warm and smelled of scorched components, and they had spent 3 months in each other's company in spaces like this, tight and functional and without any of the usual social distances. I'm thinking about something my professor said, she told him. My radio astronomy professor at the institute. What did he say? Sheenan said. She said that radio astronomy is really just an extended act of faith. You point your antenna at the dark and you listen, and most of the time you hear nothing, and you have to believe that the silence isn't the whole answer, that somewhere in it there's a signal waiting. She looked at the scorched components around her. I used to think that was about finding aliens. Gaunt waited. Now I think it's just about what you do when everything goes quiet, she said. You keep the antenna on. You keep listening. You believe the signal is there even when you can't hear it yet. He thought about this. He had a face that had been made for thinking about things, long and patient and slightly sad in its resting state. My mother used to hum, he said, and then looked at him. When things were very bad, she'd go very quiet, and then very softly she'd start humming. Not a song I recognized, just a sound. Like she was reminding herself that sound was still possible. Enan looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly casual. Then she said, Hand me the frequency calibrator, the one with the cracked housing. He handed it to her. She began working, and he began humming very softly. Something without a name, and the ship moved through the dark. 4 hours out, the Kethal fired again, this time not a probe. 2 ships opening simultaneously from the starboard quarter. Energy lances crossing in a pattern that Fasai recognized from the analysis files. A Kethal tactic they developed sometime in the second month of the war, designed to saturate the opposing ship's point defense systems by forcing them to track 2 sources in divergent angles simultaneously. It worked. The Orizaba's point defense caught 70% of the incoming fire. The remaining 30% hit the starboard secondary hull. The bridge did not shake. It lurched, a lateral force that slammed everyone not strapped in sideways and sent loose objects across the room in a spray and cracked the secondary tactical display along its left edge. Someone, Fasai, was bleeding from the temple where her head had hit her. Console housing. She wiped it without looking away from her board. Damage, Sarah said. Starboard secondary hull, decks 16 through 19. Hull integrity at 78% in that section. Breaches in 2 compartments. Automated sealing engaged. We've lost. Fasai's voice caught, very briefly. We've lost the starboard mass driver battery 3. 7 crew members in the affected zone. No survivability. 7. Sierra held that number the way you hold something hot, only as long as necessary. Continue course. Adjust point defense coverage to compensate for the battery loss. Adjusted. Fasai's voice was level again. She had learned very quickly how to do this, how to hold the number just long enough and then set it down, because the alternative was to carry all of them at once, and none of them at once, and that was how ships died. Not from weapons fire, but from the weight of accumulated numbers, carried by the people who were still moving through the task. 3 hours and 40 minutes to the focal point, Mendel said. The Cathal? They've accelerated. They're compressing their timeline. Fasai looked at her board. Either they know where we're going, or they've decided they don't want to find out. How long until bracket completion? A pause. Approximately 4 hours and 15 minutes. Sarah did the arithmetic. 3:40 to the focal point. 4:15 to bracket completion. She had 35 minutes of margin on a damaged ship with a compromised nav grid and a precision requirement of 200 meters. Mendel, she said. I know, Mendel said. I've been refining the approach for the past 4 hours. I'll get us in. I know you will. This was true. She had decided it was true, and so it was. 2 hours out, Beltran came to the bridge. He never came to the bridge. He had a standing philosophy about this. The bridge was for bridge people. The engine bay was for engine people. The boundary existed for good reasons. And he had maintained this philosophy for 20 years of service with a consistency that bordered on the theological. The fact that he was here meant something, and every person on the bridge felt the meaning of it without being told. He stood beside Sarah. He had cleaned the burn scar, or someone had cleaned it for him, and it caught the bridge lighting in a way that made it look like an illuminated coastline on an old map. I've been thinking, he said, about what the resonance does to the drives when the field compression hits. He looked at the tactical display. The Kethal shadows were closer now, filling more of the gravimetric readout. The drives are going to interpret the field compression as a catastrophic gravitational gradient. Every safety protocol in the system is going to try to shut them down or cut thrust to protect the hardware. Can you prevent that? I already have. I bypassed everything. Every single safety protocol in the drive system is now offline. She looked at him. If we hit an unexpected obstacle, we'll lose the drives, he said. Yes, he kept his eyes on the tactical display. But if we hit the focal point and the drives try to safety shut down at the moment of resonance, we won't complete the propagation cycle. We'll be in the compression field with no thrust and no control. And the drives running at full output during field compression will probably survive, 75%. The cores are built to take a lot. I've been stressing them for 2 months just by keeping us moving, and they haven't cracked yet. He paused. That's the conservative estimate. I think it's more like 82. She looked at him. She realized, one of the steadiest people she had ever known. Not because he was fearless, she was certain he wasn't, but because his fear and his judgment were calibrated to each other with a precision that she had never quite seen in anyone else. He was afraid of exactly the right things, in exactly the right amounts, and the rest he put to work. Thank you, Tomas, she said. He nodded once, the economy of a man who has never needed more than one. Then he went back to the engine bay. 1 hour out, they lost the long-range array. Einen's voice came over the comm. Flat and precise. Array is down. Sensor reroute burned out. We'll be navigating to the focal point on Mendel's last calculated coordinates. Understood, Sarah said. Commander. Einen's voice still flat. For what it's worth, the last data the array pulled showed the Kethal ships adjusting their formation again. They were beginning an aggressive acceleration burn. They're making their move. Yes. How long? A pause? The sound of someone doing mental arithmetic. They could complete the bracket in about 90 minutes at their new acceleration rate. 90 minutes? 1 hour to the focal point. They would arrive with 30 minutes to spare before the Kethal completed their encirclement. Unless, Fasai, firing solutions on the pursuing ships, Fasai said, already ahead of her. It won't stop them, but it might slow them down. All remaining batteries, everything we have. Commander will be draining the reserve capacitors. After this, we'll have approximately 1 working battery. After this, Sarah said, we won't need more than 1. The Orizaba fired. 6 mass driver batteries in a staggered alternating sequence, 23 rounds in rapid succession, a volume of fire that the ship had not produced in a single engagement for the entire 3 months of running. The kinetic energy of it, the Newtonian physics of 23 tungsten slugs being accelerated to a fraction of light speed in quick succession, imparted a slight backward pressure on the Orizaba herself that Mendel compensated for instantly, almost unconsciously, making the micro-adjustments with the confidence of someone who had been refining this approach for 4 hours and trusted the numbers. The Kethal ships evaded. They were good at it, better than anything humanity had built. But evading a concentrated barrage at this range required deviations from their heading, deviations from their acceleration profile, deviations from their encirclement timing. 7 minutes. They bought 7 minutes. Sometimes, in the arithmetic of survival, 7 minutes is the universe's entire generosity. 31 minutes, that was the margin. Mendel brought the Orizaba into the horizon point approach with 31 minutes before the Kethal would complete their bracket, and she brought her in with the kind of precision that would have been discussed for years in navigation training programs if anyone were around afterward to discuss it, threading the gradient edge of the binary system's gravitational field at the correct angle, compensating for the residual thrust decay in the port engine array, reading the focal point's own subtle gravitational signature on the dead nav, grids backup, and adjusting in real time. The focal point appeared on what remained of the sensor array as a visual distortion, a subtle warping of the stars ahead, like light bent through imperfect glass. the universe slightly wrong in a way that the eye registered as wrongness before the mind, could articulate why. It was beautiful, in the way that very dangerous things are beautiful when you are moving directly toward them. Focal point in 6 minutes, Mendel said. The bridge was quiet. Not the silence of fear. Sarah had heard that silence, and it had a particular quality, a held quality. The sound of people trying to make themselves small in the face of incoming fire. This was the other kind of silence. The working silence. The silence of everyone's hands on their boards, and everyone's eyes on their readouts, and the whole of the ship's intelligence, focused like light through a lens. Cathal firing solutions updated, Fasai said. They're going to be in loose bracket range in approximately 22 minutes. They may fire early. They won't, Sarah said. Fasai looked at her. They're methodical. They're not going to fire from a suboptimal position when they believe they have time to reach the optimal one. They don't experience urgency the way we do. She paused. And they don't know what we're doing. They don't know what this place is. They see us decelerating toward a gravitational anomaly, and they're calculating whether we're attempting to use it for defensive cover. She watched the distortion ahead. They're going to realize their mistake about 3 seconds after it's no longer relevant. 4 minutes to focal point, Mendel said. Beltran's voice from engineering. Drives at full output, safety protocols offline. All power to thrust and shield systems, we're ready. Inan, Sarah said, a pause. Then Enan's voice, from wherever she was in the ship. The cavity between decks, probably, because that seemed to be where she lived now. The resonance trigger assembly is charged and ready. When you give the command, I can activate it from here. The signal will propagate through the hull and interact with the focal point field. Think of it as dropping a resonant frequency into a tuned cavity. The cavity is the focal point. The response should, Inan. Yes, Commander. I know how it works. Are you ready? A pause that had something in it. Not uncertainty, but a kind of settling. A person finding their footing on uncertain ground. Ready. 2 minutes, Mendel said. Sarah stood at the center of the bridge, and she was aware, in that particular heightened way that comes in the narrow moments before irrevocable things, of the precise quality of the air, the recycled, machine-cleaned air of a warship in deep space, with its traces of metal and lubricant, and the particular smell of electronics run hot. She was aware of the vibration through the deck plates, the drives at full output transmitting their effort up through the bones of the ship and into the soles of her feet. She was aware of the faces around her, Fasai with the dried blood at her temple, Mendel with her young old eyes, and all the others, 200 people on the bridge and its supporting stations, and 791 in total in the living parts of the ship, each of them doing what they had been doing for 3 months, which was the specifically human thing of continuing when the mathematics said don't. She was aware of her mother. Not a presence, she was not superstitious, but a residue. The shape left in the world by a person who had made decisions in the dark, years ago, that were coming to fruit now, the planning of it, the faith of it. The act of believing, without being able to verify, that someone would be here to complete what she had started. The signal is there, Enan had said. You keep listening. You believe it's there even when you can't hear it yet. 1 minute, Mendel said. The Irzazaba crossed the edge of the focal point's gravitational gradient. The distortion ahead filled the forward display. The stars bending now, visibly bending. The universe ahead of them curved like the surface of a lens. The ship's hull groaned. A sound that traveled through the metal and the air and the bones of everyone aboard. A long, low resonance, like the lowest string of an instrument played in a cathedral. The Cathal ships were 18 minutes from optimal position. They would not reach it. On my mark, Sarah said. Her voice was level. She had her mother's voice in this moment. The voice of a woman who had decided the universe owed her nothing and was fine with that. 3-2. She thought of rain on hot metal. 1. Mark. Einan activated the trigger. What happened next did not have a human-scale description. Later, in the after-action recordings, they would try to document it. The resonance trigger interacted with the focal point field at the precise harmonic that the models, her mother's models, the conservative ones that turned out to be conservative by a factor of 2, had predicted. The gravitational resonance propagated outward through the binary system's L4 point, at a rate that the theoretical physicists who reviewed the recordings would spend the next 18 months arguing about. What they agreed on, it was fast, faster than any prior model had suggested. The field compression radiated from the focal point in a sphere that expanded at a speed that made faster than light technically incorrect, but functionally accurate for the distances involved. What happened to the Cathal ships? The field compression reached them in 14 seconds. A Cathal warship is not designed to withstand a sudden compression of the gravitational field. No ship is designed for that, because the physics of such a compression had been theoretical until the moment it was not. The effect was not, strictly speaking, destructive in the conventional sense. It was not fire, it was not blast, it was not the kind of violence that leaves recognizable wreckage. It was more like what happens to a thing built for a specific set of physical assumptions when those assumptions suddenly catastrophically change. The 4 Kethal ships ceased to register on any of the Orizaba's sensors in the span of 3 breaths. The Orizaba itself took the edge of the resonance. The propagating wave hit the hull at an angle and with a force that was at the upper end of Mendel's 73% survivability estimate, which meant it was survivable, which meant it was not comfortable. The hull stress monitors across every deck screamed into the red simultaneously. Every loose object not secured went sideways. The bridge lighting failed completely for 6 seconds and came back on emergency amber. Beltran's drives responded to the gravitational field changed the way he had predicted, by reading it as catastrophic and attempting to shut down. And because he had disabled every safety protocol, they didn't. They ran. They kept the ship moving through the compression wave with enough inertial energy to stay ahead of the worst of it. On Deck 7, a pressure seal failed and resealed. On Deck 12, an entire equipment bay sheared loose from its mounting brackets and slid 10 meters before, jamming against a structural rib. In the cavity between Decks 4 and 5, Einan and Gaunt were thrown against opposite bulkheads and lay stunned for a period that neither of them could quantify afterward, and the first thing either of them said, when the shaking stopped, was Gaunt beginning to hum again. The nameless sound, the reminder that sound was still possible. On the bridge, when the lights came back to amber and then to full, Sarah was standing. She was not sure how she was still standing. She was holding the edge of her command console, with a grip that had left marks in her palm. She looked at Mendel, who was looking at her sensors with the expression of someone who needs to confirm something 3 times before they say it. Commander, Mendel said, the Cathal ships report. There are no Cathal ships. Mendel's voice was very precise. The voice of a woman reporting a fact so large that precision is the only thing that keeps it from becoming chaos. No gravimetric signatures. No electromagnetic emissions. No debris field. A pause, there's nothing. The bridge was very quiet. Are we damaged? Sarah said. Sci-Fi was already running the report. Hull integrity at 61% across the primary hull. 44% on the starboard secondary section. No active breaches. Emergency sealing is holding across 7 compromised sections. She paused. Drives are functional. Navgrid is, actually the navgrid just came back. Partially. The compression wave did something to the backup hardware. She looked up. We have navigation. Crew. Injury reports coming in from all sections. No fatalities reported. Several serious injuries, medical teams responding. Fasai's voice held something that might, in a different context, have been the beginning of a laugh or a sob. The two are the same frequency sometimes. Commander, we're in one piece, Sarah said. We're in one piece. She stood there for a moment, in the amber light, in the smell of machine air and hot electronics, holding the edge of her console with the hand that was going to have a bruise in the shape of a locking bar by morning. She thought about the Kethal ships in the gravimetric readout, the shadows that had followed them for 18 hours, patient and methodical, experiencing time as a room to be traversed. She thought about her mother's models conservative by a factor of 2. She thought about rain on hot metal. Get me a ship-wide channel, she said. Fasai opened it. This is Commander Voss, she said. The channel was open to every corner of the Orizaba, every deck, every compartment, every utility crawl space where someone might be braced against a bulkhead in the dark. The Kethal pursuit fleet is gone. The Orizaba is damaged but structurally sound, and we are moving under our own power on a heading toward human-controlled space. Medical teams are responding throughout the ship. Engineering is assessing drive status. Navigation has been partially restored. She paused. Every one of you did something today that the Kethal have never seen done to them. Every one of you was part of something that was planned years ago, by people who trusted that humans should still be here to finish it. She thought of her mother, the photograph in the drawer, the straight back and the steady gaze. We are still here. We are going home. That's all. She closed the channel. Beltran's voice came over the engineering comm, quiet, with a dry warmth in it that she had learned to recognize as the closest he ever came to sentimentality. Nice speech, Commander. Don't tell me it was nice. It was necessary. That's acceptable. She straightened. The bruise in her hand was starting to register. How are my drives? Running. A pause. The left core is going to need a look when we're home and docked. But running. Good enough. She looked at the forward display. The binary system's paired stars hung ahead, Twin fires at this distance, warm and indifferent. Beyond them, 47 light-years of dark, and then soul, and then home. What was left of home? What they were going back to, she thought. Whatever is left, we are going back to it. That is the specifically human thing. You go back to what is left. 3 days out from the horizon point, Einan requisitioned a star chart from the nav system, an old format display, the kind that showed stars as actual points of light, rather than the tactical overlays everyone had been living with for 3 months. She printed it out on the map printer in the secondary science bay, which still worked because it was a purely mechanical device powered by a battery that the compression wave had not affected. She brought it to Gaunt in the cavity between decks 4 and 5, where he was making repairs to the sensor routing that Enan had improvised. She spread it between them in the cramped space, and they looked at it together. "Which one?" he said. She pointed to a specific star near the edge of the chart. It was not Sol. It was a small orange star in the direction of Sagittarius, about 80 light-years distant. "What is it?" he said. "It's my research target, from before." She looked at the point of light. "I was 3 months away from beginning a long-term listening survey on it when the Kethal came. The spectroscopic profile suggests a habitable zone planet. The radio submission profile suggested." She stopped. "I always thought there might be a signal there. I never got to listen." He looked at the star. "After," he said. "After," she agreed. They sat in the cavity between decks 4 and 5, the star chart between them on the warm metal floor, and the ship moved through the dark, and somewhere ahead of them was home, and the long task of explaining what had been done and beginning the longer task of doing it again and better, and somewhere behind them was nothing, which was something that had never existed in the vocabulary of this war before today, and Gaunt hummed something without a name, and Einan let herself, just for a moment, believe in the signal. 8 days after the horizon point, the Orizaba limped into the outer marker of the new Titan station, rebuilt 2 years ago in the shadow of Jupiter, smaller than its predecessor, armored in ways the original had never been, full of people who had learned lessons at a cost that made the learning feel like an obscenity. The approach beacon recognized her transponder and sent back a tone that Sarah heard in the comm earpiece, and that she would later say was the most complicated sound she had ever heard. A simple automated tone that contained, by virtue of everything it represented, more emotional weight than any music she had ever known. They were hailed immediately. A controller's voice, young, very young, the war ate the older ones, professional, and trying to keep the professionalism intact even through what was visibly not a routine approach. "Orizaba, this is New Titan Control. Confirm hull identification. We are Commander. We are showing significant hull damage on your approach profile. Do you require immediate medical response? New Titan Control, this is Commander Sarah Voss of the SS Orizaba. We are functional and mobile. Medical response docking would be appreciated, but is not emergency level. We have crew who need attention, but we are stable." She paused. "I need to speak with command as soon as we dock. Priority channel, encryption level 7. A pause that was longer than a communications delay required. She could hear, faintly, voices in the background of the control room, the sound of people telling other people something. "Commander Voss," the controller said. The professionalism had not broken, but it had become very thin, like ice you can see the water through. "Copy on medical response at docking. Copy on command contact. We will have a priority channel ready for you the moment you're secured." Another pause. "Commander, we are showing that there were 4 Kethal ships behind you when you crossed the heliopause." "Yes," Sarah said. "We're no longer reading them on any of our arrays." "No," she said, "you won't." The silence on the channel had a quality to it. The quality of people who have been fighting a war they were losing for 3 months, and who are hearing, for the first time, a number that is different from all the previous numbers. Not a new ship destroyed, not a fleet reduced. A number that reads 0 where it should read 4, in a place where the Kethal have never read 0 before. "Orizaba," the controller said, and his professional voice was thinner than ice now, thin as window glass, and she could hear what was underneath it. "Welcome home." The debrief took 6 hours. Sarah sat in a room with 8 admirals, some of them her mother's contemporaries, which was a weight she carried carefully, in both hands, and told them everything, from the moment the Orizaba had crossed the heliopause to the moment she had activated the channel to New Titan Control. She told them about the horizon point. She told them about her mother's files, and the models and the resonance trigger and the physics. She told them the 4 Kethal ships were gone in the sense of having ceased to register on any sensor at any scale. She told them what Mendel had said, there's nothing. The room was quiet in a way that rooms with 8 admirals are not typically quiet. "The resonance propagation radius," said Admiral Kassam, who had known her mother. He was very old, and he spoke slowly, not from weakness, but from the habit of someone who has spent decades ensuring that each word does exactly the work he means it to do. Your mother's models put it at approximately 8 AQU. Yes, which means it was contained to the binary system vicinity. Yes, effectively. He looked at his own hands on the table for a moment. Can it be replicated? The physics exists wherever there's a binary system with the correct mass ratio and a suitable Lagrange resonance. We've identified. She pulled up Enan's secondary analysis, compiled during the 8-day approach. 14 candidate sites within 40 light years of Sol. Some of them may have the required resonance characteristics. We would need survey missions to confirm. And the activation mechanism. Inan is writing up the full technical documentation. She had the basics report ready before we docked. Sarah looked at the admirals. The Kethal have no defense against this because they have no concept of this. They experience time as a space to move through. The idea of a trap laid in the physics of a star system, years in advance, by people who might not even be alive when it's triggered. That kind of planning requires a relationship with time that they don't have. She paused. We do. Kasim looked at her for a long moment. She held the look and let it be what it was, not a test, not a challenge, but an assessment of a person by another person who was trying to understand the full shape of what had just been handed to them. She thought of her mother in this room, or one like it, years ago. The same back, the same eyes. Your mother, he said. Yes, she said. Another silence. Then something moved in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the muscular equivalent, the brief softening of something that had been held very hard for a very long time. She was right about you, he said. Sarah looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. We need to find the 14 candidate sites, she said. We need survey ships in the field within 60 days. And I need a commitment from this room on record that the Orizaba will be repaired, not decommissioned. Why the Orizaba specifically? Because she's proven. She let that sit. And because her crew knows what the work looks like. You don't reassign that. Kasim looked at the other admirals. They exchanged something in the way that people who have worked together for years exchange things, without words, through the precise grammar of how a face moves. Then he looked back at her. 60 days, he said, and the Orizaba stays intact. Sarah did not go to her quarters that night. She went instead to the observation deck of New Titan Station, a long curve of transparent aluminum looking out at Jupiter, and the dark at the gas giant's banded surface, and the points of light that were the other moons, and beyond them the rest of the solar system, a neighborhood she had grown up in, and left and fought her way back to. She stood at the window the way you stand at a window when you have been in a closed metal room for months and the sight of genuine distance. Even the distance of vacuum and radiation and nothing you can breathe feels like a kind of mercy. Inan came to stand beside her after a while, then Gaunt, then Fasai, still with the bruise at her temple from where her head had hit the console housing, yellow, now at the edges. Then Mendel. Then Beltran, who had never been to an observation deck in 20 years of service, and looked like he was unsure of the etiquette. They stood at the window and looked at Jupiter. There's a star, Inan said after a while. She wasn't looking at Jupiter. She was looking past it, into the dark beyond. About 80 light years away. I think there might be a signal there. I never got to listen. Nobody asked her what she meant. They understood, in the way that people who have been through the same thing understand things that don't need full explication. The signal, the thing you keep your antenna pointed toward in the silence, the belief that the answer is there even when you can't hear it. After, Gaunt said. After, Inan agreed. They stood there together in the cold light of Jupiter and the distant fire of Sol, and the dark that was no longer only an enemy but a place, the way it had always been a place before all of this. A place that contained signals and questions and the long quiet patience of stars that have been burning since before anything on this planet had learned to walk upright or build fires or point instruments at the dark and listen. Sarah looked at the window. She looked at the reflection in it. Her own face, the faces of the people beside her, the Orizaba somewhere below in the docking bay with her cracked hull, and her bent secondary structure, and her 4 remaining mass driver batteries, and her drives that were going to need a look when they were home and docked, which they now were. She looked at Jupiter. She thought about her mother, the photograph in the drawer, the straight back, and the steady gaze, the cipher on a birthday message that turned out not to be for birthdays. She thought about the specific kind of love that plans 14 years ahead in the dark, trusting that someone will be there to finish it, and she thought that this was maybe what it meant to be human in the end. Not the stubbornness, not the adaptability, not the ingenuity, though those were real and they mattered. What it meant to be human was to believe in the people who came after you, to trust them with the work, to leave the signal there for them to find. She let herself breathe, in out, the oldest rhythm, the one that was as there before the ships, before the wars, before everything. The stars were very old, and they were still burning. They stayed at the window for a long time. Later, 3 weeks later, when the Orizaba was in dry dock and the repairs were underway and the first survey missions were being crewed and the physics papers were circulating in classified channels and causing the kind of quiet, precise excitement among people who are paid to be excited quietly and precisely. Einan submitted her formal post-action technical report on the resonance trigger assembly. It was 411 pages long. The executive summary was 8 sentences. The last sentence read, "The horizon point activation demonstrates that the most effective strategic advantage is not a weapon or a ship or a technology, but a decision made in sufficient time by someone with sufficient trust in the future and sufficient willingness to not be present for its outcome." Kasim read that sentence twice. Then he had it printed and put on the wall of his office, and he left it there for the rest of the war, which was not short and not easy, but which had, from that day forward, a different shape, the shape of something that could be ended. 14 candidate sites, 14 echoes of the horizon point, 14 places in the geometry of human explored space where the physics had been waiting, patient as mountains, for someone who knew what to listen for. The galaxy, it turned out, had quite a lot to learn. It was learning it now. The night before the Orizaba reached the 4th candidate site, Sarah could not sleep. This was not unusual. She had not slept well in 3 months. The particular kind of sleep that comes when you command a ship in a war is not the kind that fully rests. Being always partly conscious of the deck plate vibration, always partly listening for the alert tone, always partly running the arithmetic of the situation you're in and the situation you're approaching. It was the sleep of a person who had decided that full unconsciousness was not available and partial unconsciousness was acceptable. She went to the observation deck. It was empty at this hour, the small lounge, with its transparent aluminum panels, and its handful of chairs, and the old habit that ship's crews had of treating it as a social space during the day, and a private one at night, respecting an unwritten protocol about the individual's right to stand alone in front of the stars for a while. She stood alone in front of the stars. The 4th candidate site was a binary system. Different configuration from the horizon point, a yellow dwarf paired with a red dwarf in a wider orbit, and the resonance characteristics that Eason survey had confirmed were not identical to the horizon points but were functionally equivalent, the same fundamental physics expressed through a different geometry. Her mother's files had noted this possibility, that the specific numbers would vary by site, but the underlying principle would hold. The underlying principle was this, that a binary system's gravitational interaction creates resonance nodes in the L-point positions the way a resonating cavity creates standing waves in sound, and that the nodes could be activated by a correctly tuned trigger, and that the activation propagated the resonance through the local gravitational field at a rate determined by the mass of the system and the orbital characteristics. The 4th site's parameters suggested a propagation radius of approximately 6.4 astroyumitu and a propagation speed in the same range as the horizon points. The Kethel patrol point within that system was at 5.8 astayugyu from the resonance node. Sarah had done the calculation many times. She did it again now, standing at the observation deck window. She did not need to do it again. She did it because there was a kind of comfort in the doing of it, the specific comfort of a calculation that keeps coming out the same way, that doesn't change when you run it in the dark on no sleep, that holds its shape because the math is sound. The math was sound. She thought about the Kethel patrol. She thought about 14 warships in a holding pattern. She had the count from Fasai's intercept analysis, 14 ships, a standard Kethal sector patrol, and she thought about the patient, methodical geometry of their formation, the way they move through space, as through a room, the administrative certainty of what they were doing. She thought about the fact that those 14 ships had killed things, not ships. She could hold the loss of ships in the abstract, the way you hold any loss in the abstract when the scale becomes large enough. But the ships had carried people, and the people had carried other people inside them. The specific inheritance that every person carries of everyone who made them. She had not permitted herself to think about this for 3 months, because thinking about it was not useful, and using it was dangerous, the kind of fuel that burns hot and burns through the container. She permitted herself to think about it now, briefly, in the observation deck in the dark, because tomorrow the math would be finished, and it would require a clear head to finish it, and she had found that a controlled burn was better than a suppressed one. She thought about all of it for approximately 4 minutes, and then she set it down and she looked at the stars. They were, as stars are, indifferent. They had been burning for billions of years before this war and would burn for billions more after it, and the specific outcomes of specific battles around specific star systems were, from their perspective, not a meaningful category of event. She had made peace with this a long time ago, the vast indifference of the physical universe and the specific intimacy of what happened inside it. You could find the indifference cold, or you could find it clarifying. She had chosen clarifying. She heard footsteps, not in this time, heavier. Beltran came and stood beside her. He was in his off-duty clothes, which were identical to his on-duty clothes, except that the top fastening of the collar was undone, which was the only concession to relaxation that she had ever seen him make. They stood in silence for a while. "You think about your family," she said. It was not a question. She had been on ships with him, long enough to recognize the look. "My brother," he said. He was on Titan's station. She hadn't known this. She looked at him. He was looking at the stars. The original station, he said. When it fell, he was quiet for a moment. He was a maintenance technician. He worked on the external structures. He would have known what was happening before anyone else. He paused. He would have been very practical about it. She thought about his brother, a maintenance technician, a person who fixed things with his hands and knew the structures of things from the inside. A family trait, apparently. "I think about him," Beltran said. "And then I think about tomorrow." They're the same thought. She understood. The grief and the purpose becoming, over time, the same direction, not because the grief was resolved, but because it had been folded into the work, made part of it, carried forward as motivation rather than weight. It was not something she had done consciously. It was something that had happened because the work didn't stop, and you either integrated the grief into the work, or you stopped, and she had not stopped. She said, "Tomorrow," he agreed. They stood there a while longer, and then they went to their respective quarters, and they slept the partial sleep of people who had decided partial was acceptable, and in the morning the Orizava was 11 hours from the 4th candidate site, and everything that needed to be done was already in motion. Fasai, the night before the 4th site, wrote a letter. She had not written letters before the war. She was the kind of person who communicated in brief and practical terms and found the longer forms of written communication slightly uncomfortable, as though she were being asked to perform an intimacy she didn't feel. The war had changed this. The war had made her understand, in the accelerated way it made everyone understand things, that the brief practical forms were adequate for normal situations, and that the war was not normal, and that the people who mattered to her did not know, in sufficient detail, that they mattered. She wrote to her grandmother in Morocco. Her grandmother was 91 years old and had lived through 3 different kinds of upheaval that she classified, from oldest to most recent, as colonial aftermath, ecological crisis, and alien invasion, the last of which she found, according to her letters to Fasai, less surprising than the previous 2. She had a view of history that was very long and a view of the present that was very specific, and she had sent Fasai a message after the Battle of Ceres that said, "The universe is not new to being difficult. Neither are we. Come home when you can." Fasai wrote, "I am going to try to come home. I don't know when. I want you to know that I have the stone. It was in my hand when the ship took the worst of it, and I held it through everything, and it is still here, and I am still here, and I think you were right about what it means." She sent the letter. Then she went back to her board and ran the approach calculations for the 4th candidate site one more time, because that was what she had and that was what she did. Mendel, the night before, did not write letters and did not go to the observation deck. She sat at her navigation console on the quiet bridge. The overnight watch was minimal. 3 people maintaining the ship's heading, no one at the primary nav station because the course was locked, and the automated systems were handling, and she ran the precision approach for the 4th candidate site. She had been running it for 4 days. It was a different geometry from the horizon point. The binary configuration meant the resonance focal point's position, relative to the orbital plane, was offset by 11 degrees, which changed the approach angle, and the red dwarf's mass introduced a slight gravitational gradient perturbation that needed to be compensated for in the final 300 kilometers of approach. She had built the compensation into the approach algorithm. She had tested it. She was going to run it again. This was not anxiety. She had learned the difference. Anxiety ran the calculation, hoping it would come out differently, fearing it would come out the same way, looking for errors that would explain why what was going to happen didn't have to happen. This was something else. This was the thing you do when precision is required. And you have accepted that precision is required. And you are simply ensuring that the precision is there when you need it. The calculation came out right. As it had for 4 days, she ran it again. On the morning of the 4th candidate site, at 4 hours' distance, Sarah called the ship to general quarters. Not because there was immediate threat. The Kethal patrol was not aware of Orizaba's approach, as far as Fasai could determine. They were 14 ships in a standard holding pattern, conducting their administrative cleansing, with the methodical confidence of something that had never had a reason to hurry, but because general quarters was what you called when something was about to happen, that required every person on the ship to be exactly where they needed to be, doing exactly what they needed to be doing. With complete and present attention, the ship answered. She heard it in the change of sounds, the acceleration of footsteps in the corridors, the opening and closing of compartment doors, the particular increase in comm traffic as departments checked in. She heard it in the change of the bridge, where her people came to their stations with the focused quality of people who have done something difficult before, and know they are about to do it again and have made their peace with that. Fasai, Mendel, the new tactical team supplementing the positions that had been lost over 3 months. Beltran's voice from engineering, the daily constant of it. And on the secondary science board at the back of the bridge, where a position had been newly installed because Sarah had insisted on it and Kasim had approved it without argument. Inan, back from the Paracas, back from the survey because the 4th site was confirmed, and what came after the survey was the activation, and the activation required the person who had built the trigger. Gaunt, Sarah said. Here, said his voice from behind Inan's station. He was officially Inan's technical assistant. He was unofficially wherever Inan was. Good, Sarah said. That was all she said. She looked at the forward display. The binary system was visible now. 2 stars at this distance resolved into distinct objects. The yellow dwarf warm and steady, the red dwarf cooler and larger on the angular scale, both of them burning with the patient fire of things that had been burning since before the first human put a word to the concept of light. She thought of her mother. She thought, look. She thought, this is what you built. This is what you trusted me to finish. Commander, Mendel said. Focal point in 4 hours, 20 minutes. The Kethal? Fasai? Fasai looked at her board. The expression on her face was the expression of someone holding something precious and not yet knowing what it is. The patrol is at their standard interval, she said. They are entirely unaware of our approach. Sarah nodded. Let's show them, she said, that the horizon has a lesson in it. The Orizaba flew forward into the light of the paired stars, and her crew sat at their boards and held the calculations and breathed the machine air of a living ship going forward with purpose, and ahead of them the resonance node waited in the geometry of the binary system, like a word that had been placed in a sentence 14 years ago and had been waiting ever since for someone to read it aloud. They would read it now. They would read it in the language that the Kethal had never learned, which was the language of patience. Not the patience of something that moves through time as a room and does not tire, but the patience of something that moves through time as a current and plants things along the bank for the people who will come after and trusts they will come and trusts that they will find it. The other kind, the harder kind, the kind that requires you to believe in people you will never meet. Admiral Voss had believed. Her daughter was here. The Orizaba flew forward, and the stars burned, and the galaxy had not yet finished learning what it had made the mistake of waking. It had 14 more lessons to go. A mid-tonnage science ship called the Paracas, crewed by a skeleton team of 12, departed New Titan Station on a heading toward the nearest of the 14 candidate sites. Inan was on it, she had asked. Kasim had been reluctant. Sarah had told Kasim, in the flat, uncomplicated way she had learned to tell admirals things, that Inan was the only human being who had built and activated a resonance trigger from scratch under fire with a fused junction box and a borrowed passive sensor array, and that the survey missions needed her, and that the war needed the survey missions, and that the conversation was over. Kasim had agreed with the expression of a man who has found it more efficient to agree with certain people than to continue the discussion. Gaunt went with her. He had put in the transfer request before she even had confirmation that she was going. When she found out, she had looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone doing a calculation, not about whether she was glad, which she clearly was, but about the right way to say it. You didn't have to, she said. I know, he said. She handed him the frequency calibrator, the cracked housing one. He took it. On the Paracas, in the weeks of travel to the first candidate site, Inan built a new listening apparatus from the ship's sensor array Not for the resonance, but for the older purpose, the one she had been trained for. The small orange star 80 light-years away was not on the survey route, but a ship moving through the galaxy accumulates data. Incidentally, the way a person walking through a city notices things that aren't their destination. She had the passive sensors running toward it whenever the geometry allowed. She was listening. She heard nothing. Not yet. But she kept the antenna on. The Orizaba's repairs took 4 months. Sarah spent most of that time in briefings and planning sessions and the specific kind of war work that happens away from the front, the logistics of manufacturing resonance trigger components at scale, the training of crews who would activate the candidate sites when the time came, the strategic mapping of Kethal patrol routes relative to the 14 sites. It was desk work, which she hated, made bearable by the fact that it was desk work with a direction, and directions were what she understood. Beltran spent the 4 months in the dry dock supervising the hull repairs personally, which was unnecessary by every official protocol, but which he maintained was necessary by every engineering protocol, which he considered more authoritative. The Orizaba's port side was rebuilt in sections, new ablative armor laid in sheets, the mass driver battery 3 position refilled with a salvaged unit from a decommissioned escort vessel. The starboard secondary hull took 6 weeks alone. He sent Sarah progress photographs with no commentary, which she understood as his form of reassurance. The image of the new armor plates going in, solid and clean, speaking for itself. She pinned them to the wall beside her workstation. Her mother's photograph was in the drawer. The progress photographs were visible, which was intentional. Fasai was promoted. She received the formal letter in her temporary quarters at New Titan Station and read it 3 times, and then went and found Sarah and handed it to her without saying anything, which Sarah understood. You don't say anything when something overdue finally arrives. You just let someone else hold it for a moment to make it real. Lieutenant Commander, Sarah said. I had a good ship, Fasai said. You had good hands. Fasai took the letter back. She folded it with care and put it in her breast pocket, and that was the whole ceremony, which was exactly the right length. Mendel was recruited, during the 4 months, by 3 different institutions and 2 admirals with assignments to offer. She turned all of them down. She sent Sarah a message at the end of the 3rd refusal that said simply, waiting for the Orizaba. Sarah forwarded it to Beltran. He sent back, give her a raise. Sarah sent back, she's a navigator, not a contractor. Beltran sent back, then give her a title that fits what she actually did. Sarah gave Mendel the title of Senior Navigation Specialist and a research allocation and a standing seat on the Orizaba's primary bridge for all. Future operations, and Mendel sent back a single word, good. On the day the Orizaba was cleared for return to active service, Sarah walked through her from bow to stern. Not an inspection. She had done the inspection with Beltran the day before, methodical and documented. This was something else. The walk a person takes through a house before they leave, or return to, that is not about checking the locks. This was about memory and continuity, and the specific weight of a ship that has been through something and is still here. Deck 1 the bridge. The cracked secondary tactical display had been replaced. The console housings were new. The emergency amber lighting had been replaced with full spectrum. Though she knew from experience that the amber would come back on the first time, they took fire and she was glad it would. The bridge smelled of new composite flooring and fresh sealant and the faint metallic signature of recalibrated electronics. It smelled like the Orizaba after maintenance, which was its own specific smell, different from the Orizaba during flight, and different from the Orizaba after damage, and different from any other ship she had ever been on. Deck 4. The cavity between decks 4 and 5, with its junction box and its repaired sensor routing and its new passive array hardware. She stood at the hatch and looked in. Someone had left a small star chart in there, a printed one, the same format as the one Einan had brought from the secondary science bay. She left it where it was. Deck 7, the crew mess. There were people there. Some of the crew was already aboard for pre-departure preparations, and they saw her, and the room did the thing it always does when a commanding officer enters unexpectedly, which is go briefly quiet and then try to return to normal. She told them to continue, which they did, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and watched them, and heard the particular mix of sounds that a room full of people being normal generates, the specific rhythm of it, the overlapping voices, the sound of a coffee cup set on a table, and thought that this was the thing the Kethal had been trying to remove and had not removed and would not remove. Not the warships, not the weapons, this. Deck 12, the equipment bay, where a section of the internal frame had sheared loose during the resonance wave and been welded back in place and reinforced with additional brackets. The weld lines were still visible under the new paint, which Beltran had left that way deliberately. She had not asked him why, and he had not explained. Engine bay. She put her hand on a drive housing and felt the warmth of it, the readiness of it, the particular quality of a machine that has been tuned and is ready to perform. The drive team moved around her with the focused efficiency of people who are about to depart and have a great deal to do and would prefer to do it without a commanding officer standing in the middle of their workspace. But they made no indication of this because they were professionals and because it was their commander and because there was a specific courtesy in the engine bay that Beltran had established over 20 years that said this is everyone's space when it matters. She thought, Tomas, she thought, you disabled every safety protocol in this engine bay and ran us into a gravitational compression wave at full thrust and the drives held. She thought that there was no formal citation for this because what he had done was technically a violation of 7 separate engineering safety protocols, which were the kind of violations that were very difficult to celebrate officially. She had found another way. His name would be on the primary drive system's maintenance plaque, the one that listed the engineers responsible for the ship's engines. His name had been there before as chief engineer. She had added a second line below it, not an official designation, just words, in the small engraved script that maintenance plaques used. He knew what the drives could take. She had not told him about it. He would find it when he found it. The departure from New Titan Station on the Orzov's return to active service was not marked by ceremony. There was no ceremony in wartime for a ship returning to the front. There were forms and checklists, and a departure clearance from New Titan Control, and the methodical process of a ship powering up its systems in sequence and undocking and pulling away from the station on thrusters, and then lighting the main drives. Sarah stood at the bridge, watching the station shrink behind them. The crew was at their stations, new faces in some positions, familiar ones in others. Fasai Mendel, Beltran's voice from engineering. The bridge smelled of new composite and metal, and the faint trace of recycled air that would, within a few hours, acquire the specific character of the Orizaba in flight. Heading, Mendel said. The 4th candidate site, Sarah said. Einen's survey confirmed the resonance characteristics 2 weeks ago. The Kethal have a patrol route through that system. They use it as a staging point. Mendel was already laying in the coordinates. Transit time at standard cruise? 12 days. The Kethal patrol interval? Fasai answered from her board. 14 days. 2 days of margin. She thought that's enough. She thought, 14 years of planning, 2 days of margin, she thought. Some things don't change. Set course, she said. The Orizaba turned onto her heading, the drive cycling up from thrusters to main thrust in the even sequence that Sarah felt as a change in the vibration through the deck plates. The idle tremor of maneuvering versus the steady, deep, directional push of a ship going somewhere with purpose. She looked at the forward display. The stars shifted as the ship's orientation changed, the familiar constellation slide side and sides and settling into the new view. The view ahead, the direction they were going. Jupiter was behind them. Sol was behind them. The dark was ahead, and in the dark were 14 candidate sites, and in those sites were the compressed equations her mother had written years ago. In the certainty that someone would be here to use them. Someone was here. Commander, Mendel said. Her young old eyes were on the forward display. We're clear of the station traffic zone. Ahead full. The drives answered. The Orizaba accelerated into the dark, and somewhere 80 light years away, an orange star burned in its old patient fire, and the signal it was keeping, whatever it was, if it was anything at all, waited in the frequency, as signals do, for someone to point their antenna in the right direction and listen.